This week, it's time to revisit the story of hasidic yeshiva schools in New York City having poor secular education. After all, it's important not just to understand what is happening, but why and how things came to be this way. So I talked to sociologist Matty Lichtenstein about her research on hasidic yeshiva advocacy. I'm Lev Gringauz, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. If you want to subscribe to our weekly TCG Folk newsletter for local Minnesota Jewish news, our monthly podcast newsletter for updates on all our podcasts, or our soon-to-fully launch newsletter for Cincinnati Jewish news, go to tcgfolk.com and hit that subscribe button at the top of the screen. We recently updated our food podcast, now called Not Your Bubby's Nosh, so go check that out. And we're also rolling again with Kumba Hineni, our social justice and intersectionality podcast. Links for everything are in the podcast notes. As of the release of this podcast, it's day 288 of Russia's war in Ukraine. If you want to donate to help Ukraine, there's a link in the podcast notes with resources to do that. Before setting the stage for Matty Lichtenstein, now that we're getting into the end of 2022, I wanted to take a little bit of time just to say thank you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. It's been a wild year. Obviously, for anyone who knows me, the most present subject in my mind is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war there. And it has been, I guess, gratifying in a lot of ways to have this podcast as an outlet, to do episodes about Ukraine and what this conflict means for Jews of my background, Russian-speaking Jews around the world. At the same time, even as I was using this podcast as a personal outlet, all of you decided that I was worth tuning in for, and this podcast worth listening to. And you've joined in over the course of episodes that have spanned from chatting about Jews and fandom to the end of Roe v. Wade, to internet and content moderation policy, Israel, of course, and lots more. As Jewish news usually goes, a kind of eclectic ride. Last year, as I was starting this podcast back up after a summer hiatus, I was getting roughly 330 to 350 total downloads and listens a month. And at several points this year, monthly downloads nearly doubled, on the edge of 600 a month. For a tiny Minnesota Jewish podcast production that to me just feels like I'm ranting in a basement, I think that's pretty amazing. And you all are tuning in from literally all over the world. Sure, 85% of my listens are in the US, but some of you are downloading this podcast in Canada, Israel, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Germany, and many other places. And of my US listens, only about 20% are in Minnesota. I think New Mexico, South Dakota, and Alaska are the only states where no one is listening to this podcast. I still can't take myself seriously as a podcaster. I've never been able to, but if this is providing value to you enough that you come back episode after episode, or even just for an occasional listen, as a journalist, that really is gratifying, and I hope that I can continue to fulfill that value next year as well. So thank you for supporting this podcast and listening. If you feel so inclined, there's a link to donate to Jewfolk Inc. in the podcast notes. We appreciate anything you can give. If you or someone you know is interested, we're always looking for advertising partners also on the Jewfolk Podcast Network. You can find my email in the podcast notes if you want to be in touch. All right, now let's talk this conversation with Matty Lichtenstein, a research fellow at the Watson Institute at Brown University. As a recap, in September, the New York Times covered how many Hasidic yeshiva boys' schools in New York City have abysmal secular education on subjects like English, math, and science. At the same time, they've also received over $1 billion in public funding over the past 4 years. This is a fairly complex story, but it also has some fundamentally basic elements. Jewish private schools are taking taxpayer money and, at the same time, violating New York state education law. The law says that private schools need to give students a substantially equivalent education to what kids in public schools are learning, aka English, math, and science. And the yeshivot have been allowed to do this by New York politicians and administrators for years. I'm condensing things a lot, so if you want to get a fuller scope of this, you can revisit episode 84 of this podcast, where I talked to a graduate of Ole Torah, one of the Hasidic boys Yeshivot, about his experience with the education he got and how to understand the New York Times story. Organizations like Yafed, linked in the podcast notes, have been calling attention to the lack of quality secular education in Hasidic Yeshivot for almost a decade now. Jewish journalists and newspapers have covered this issue, but of course, it's a different experience entirely when the New York Times comes up to bat, sparking tons of conversations and breaking the subject into a media environment way beyond the Jewish community. But here's what continued to capture me about this story. It's one thing to read the New York Times and see these numbers, $1 billion of taxpayer funding received by Yeshivot over the last 4 years while violating the law without oversight. But it's another thing to ask, wait, how did these schools get $1 billion without public oversight? And why have these schools been allowed to operate like this by the state? Basically, how did we actually get here? And what might come next as New York negotiates over new education standards that, theoretically, could address the lack of secular education in Hasidic Yeshivot. And to my luck, in the days after the New York Times story dropped, I saw Lichtenstein on Twitter talking about having just published a research paper about the strategies that yeshiva advocates use to make this system work, and the interplay between yeshivot and the state that created this opportunity for Hasidic schools in the first place. She published an op-ed in JTA about this, which is linked in the podcast notes, but I still wanted to bring her on the podcast to talk a little more in depth about her research. And interestingly enough, this ended up being a bigger story, not just about Hasidic boys' schools, but about how fractured the American education system is, competing ideologies around education, and ignorance on the part of state administrators, Orthodox Jews, and liberal Jews. I am a huge geek for research and good academia, but I know those things can often be really inaccessible to people when it comes to the language used and the expectation of pre-existing knowledge. If you want to read it yourself, Lichtenstein's paper is linked in the podcast notes, but I hope this episode helps bridge that gap between academia and, I guess, us normies and non-academic folk on this subject. Okay, this conversation with Lichtenstein has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. Just to help orient listeners, can you walk through your background a bit and how you ended up or decided to do this research on Hasidic Yeshiva schools?
So I grew up in a hasidic community in Brooklyn, and I attended hasidic all-girls schools. My siblings and relatives mostly attended either hasidic or non-hasidic schools, and so I had a pretty good sense of that community. My family was had a very strong focus on education and reading, and we had lots and lots of books in every room in our house. And I also went to a school that was the girls' school, which was Beis Yaakov Ger, actually had pretty good standards of education, followed, I believe, state guidelines. We took state tests. And so I got a pretty decent education. And as I got older and I pursued more education, I no longer identified as a member of the Hasidic community, but I still worked with people from that community. And I have remained religious. And so I've always maintained connections with people from that community and had a lot of interactions with them in my own work. When I started my PhD, I knew I wanted to study issues related to the state and also to religion. Did a few different projects. And one of them was this one, which was I became interested. This was back in 2013. In how this issue of regulation of Hasidic education was developing in New York State. This was when the issue was just starting to get a little bit of attention. As I researched it, it was kind of a slow process because eventually I transitioned to a different focus for my PhD on child welfare policy broadly and on maternal health. And so it became supposedly a side project, but one that took up a lot of time. And the publication process was quite slow because academia is well known for its, profound commitment to inefficiency. And so it took a really long time for it to get published. But one of the things that made it interesting that by dragging it out for so long, because the issue sort of intensified in its attention and sort of culminated in this New York Times article in September, I was able to sort of document that process and that development as part of my paper. And so I think it ultimately made the paper a lot more interesting. And I ended up The paper ended up, actually coming out just 2 months before the New York Times article was posted. And so it was relatively quite current. And so that was how I got interested in it. And that's how the paper developed.
As you were going into this research, what kind of answers were you expecting? Because you mentioned in your paper that your perception at the beginning was really around that like yeshiva schools could get this public funding without much oversight because they had, the political lobbying, at play. So how did that perception sort of shape where you started?
The first thing that happened is that I realized that a lot of what happens on the ground in terms of educational regulation doesn't actually happen in the politician's office. They might pass some funding or they might pass a law, but all of the regulation, the substantive interpretation and implementation of the law happens in the offices of administrators and regulators that work in the Department of Education or in contracted agencies that work with them. And so my interest was, how did these people who are unelected, who are the ones who are actually doing this on the ground, how did they work with these schools? How did this happen? And what sort of the larger framework that drove this question is that there's just such a fundamental conflict between the concepts of the meaning and value of education between the hasidic, not just hasidic, between really the ultra-Orthodox world and the secular educational organizations. And part of my interest in this came from the fact that in sociology of education, they talk about, John Myers in particular talks about how education is the secular religion. Right. So there's this really profound ideology that's built into the importance and meaning and legitimizing function of education. And it's genuinely seen as a value that motivates people to, dedicate their lives to it. And so then you have these people who have a completely different concept of education. And Jonathan Bayarin has written in a really interesting way about how, not specifically to education, but to the broader project of creating members of society that what we try to produce as a society. He argues for the distinction between aspirationally independent, autonomous individual that is seen as the aspirational ideal of the Western educational system, in very much in contrast with what he calls the genealogical individual of the Hasidic community, which is someone who is socialized into seeing their identity as fundamentally social, as fundamentally connected to their society and to their history. So it's just a very different concept of identity and meaning. Now, this being said, I think this is somewhat of an sort of ideal type. So I think this is a complicated thing, but there's still this fundamental conflict around what the meaning of education really is. And so that's what sort of drove my broader interest in the subject. And then practically, I just wanted to find out, how does this work? How do the schools get this money? How do they get the state to not just get the money? What I started realizing is how do they work with them on, they get all these programs, these special education teachers, et cetera, et cetera. How do they actually work with them? How do these various regulatory norms develop? And so that's what sort of drove my interest.
And before going further, I want to ask you to sort of explain the mindset a little bit more that's at play, because the way you sort of phrase it in your paper is a lot of the educators at these Hasidic yeshivot talk about sort of learning as a term for Torah study, but you don't learn writing or math. You study it for a functional and thus inferior purpose, is the way you put it, such as obtaining a job. So can you sort of open that up a little bit for people who were not raised in that world, don't understand it super well, of when we're talking about this fundamental clash of ideologies about what education means, what is the sort of Hasidic mindset of that?
Right. So the Talmudic expression is Torah keneged kulam. Talmud Torah keneged kulam is something that many Orthodox Jews say every day. And that basically means the study of Torah is the equivalent of everything else. So it's basically, the idea is that Torah study in itself is not just a really important thing to do, but it's something that really is the meaning, purpose, and almost the life force of the universe. And without Torah study, there's just, there isn't real meaning to the world. It has everything in it, all the most important values, all the most important ideals. Our understanding of how to behave and how to live our lives is also within Torah. So with this sort of understanding, it's seen as, fundamentally different than the kind of practical knowledge you need to do sort of the things you need to get through the basic activities of life. Torah study is seen as at a very different level. And it's also seen as fundamentally more valuable. And this is what I mean when I say it's in some ways parallels, even as it profoundly conflicts with sort of these aspirational ideas of education as something in the secular world, as something that, qualitatively improves people and makes them people who are able to engage in the world in a more meaningful way. So to some degree, it parallels that, but it kind of adds this very spiritual element, and is part of this framework in which Torah study is something that is not just what I call it is not just the value, the core values of this Hasidic and of really the broader Orthodox world, but it's also the disciplining force of the society. It's how we understand what to actually do, how to live our lives. It's how we understand authority. And here's the important thing. Because of Orthodox understandings of, who does this Torah study, it is fundamentally gendered, right? Because women learn Torah for the sake of something else, right? They learn Torah in order to be able to know how to lead a religious Jewish lifestyle and to be able to raise their children, etc. But the people who learn Torah for the sake of learning Torah, for the sake of, keeping this life force alive, that's men. And so it's a fundamentally gendered thing. Part of, the fact that it's that important means that yeshivas want to spend a lot of time on it. That is one of sort of the arguments I would hear from some of the people who weren't necessarily supportive of this trend, but who described, being children in the 60s and 70s and going to ultra-Orthodox Hasidic schools where they did provide a decent secular education, and basically saying over time it becomes competition of who could do less in terms of secular studies. And so it's part like a real belief in the value of Torah study, but it's also part a really strong emphasis on, sort of social conformity and the social pressure to show that you value this pursuit, which is something that has been traditionally highly valued by Jewish communities historically. So it's not new. Hasidic communities did not invent this in order to get into a fight with the New York State Department of Education. But they do have a very strong concept of what that actually looks like.
And just to sort of my understanding of that is also that, while that has existed obviously for a long time in Jewish tradition, it really escalated after the Holocaust in terms of trying to sort of preserve Jewish tradition and preserve Jewish life, and sort of really escalated the amount of learning for learning's sake and much less of a focus on secular education.
I think that's to some degree true. I think other things that need to be accounted for is that this was the first time that Jews could really benefit from modern welfare states. And so, I don't think these values were less important in the pre-war world, but I think that, there aren't a lot of people who are willing to literally starve for Torah study, right? Or, do with very little. And suddenly, even doing with very little doesn't mean you're going to go hungry for most people. So it's a very different concept of what it means to devote yourself to Torah. And then the other sort of factor I think that's here is important to keep in mind that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, you were really talking about, just really tiny numbers of survivors of these communities relative to what had been before. The Holocaust just absolutely decimated these communities. And one of the things that happened, not necessarily in the first decade or even the second decade after the Holocaust, but by the 80s and 90s, it began to become clear, and certainly in the past few decades it's become clear, is that there's just a very high birth rate. And so it's to some degree about, these really strong emphasis on Torah study, and it's also just having a lot more people to do it with. And that's something that I think the state institutions and also secular Jewish organizations have increasingly had to contend with, the fact that this is just a growing population and a growing presence in our political and social landscape, our ultra-Orthodox Jews, that is.
So now to sort of get to the big center of your research in this case, which is you settle on sort of identifying 3 strategies that Hasidic Yeshiva use to, get public funding and these services without necessarily the oversight. Compliance markers, category conflation, and discursive proofs. And I want to ask you to explain those and bridge the academic language here for listeners. When you boil it down, what are these 3 things? And how do they fit together to help Hasidic yeshivot as well? Because there's sort of an interplay.
So I frame it as basically a sort of toolkit of strategies. So it's basically the Hasidic community over the past few decades. And really, you have to think of the lobbying as it's almost never only Hasidic schools. Like we're talking the Aguda, we're talking the OU. They represent a whole range of schools. I also interviewed people who specifically advocated for their own or for a group of Hasidic schools. So you do have some of that happening, but it's a very loose landscape of professional organizations, individual advocates who have taken it upon themselves to regularly visit lawmakers and Department of Education and sort of advocate for the yeshiva's interests. So you have a sort of messy landscape of advocacy, which is why I don't really refer to them for the most part as lobbyists. I refer to them as advocates because a lot of them are not actually professional, though some of them are, and the professional ones do a lot. Okay, so with that little caveat out of the way I frame it is that there's the yeshiva advocates use this sort of toolkit of multiple strategies that they have to develop in response to changing circumstances. So it's semi-historical the way I laid out, or chronological really. So in the early 2000s, and which is really where my research starts, but it builds on what I know of what was going on in the 1980s and 1990s. I'm really starting in the early 2000s. And one of the things that happens at that point, yeshivas were basically benefiting from the programs that had been set up by the Aguda in New York State, which essentially allow them to receive a certain amount of funding for doing a certain amount of administrative activity. And so that administrative activity is part of what I call compliance markers, which basically it's the kind of stuff you do that makes you seem like a standard school. You have classrooms, you take attendance, you give certain tests, you need certain textbooks, and so that you look like a school. And so you're able to basically get what's called a BEDS code in New York State. That doesn't necessarily mean you're registered with the state. It just means they recognize that you are a school. And that makes you, in turn, eligible for a certain amount of funding. Part of what I show happens, though, over time is that these compliance markers are not just purely symbolic. I show how, in interviews, some of these educators talk about how they, went into certain yeshivas and they felt like it was very disorganized. There wasn't a curriculum. And they wanted to impose a certain structure. They wanted to make sure there were well-developed lesson plans. There were report cards. There were, things were actually structured. And so there was you sort of see this internalization of some of these, what seems like symbolic compliance. Another sort of thing I show is that sometimes that even extends outwards. So for example, when yeshiva started to get, as I can explain more in detail, yeshiva started to get federal funding for special education programs. They actually, in some cases, developed techniques for teaching native Yiddish speakers English literacy that built on Yiddish literacy learning. So, for example, teaching vowels and consonants separately. So I got this from an interview for someone who works for an agency that's contracted with a DOE. So this is not a religious, not a Hasidic person. It's not someone who's trying to say, oh, look how great the yeshivas are doing. But he's describing to me how these secular agencies are actually learning from some of these techniques that are being developed, usually by these female educators who have credentials in special education. And they're developing these techniques that are then, essentially externalized. So these symbolic compliance, it's not as simple as like, we're basically just doing the paperwork compliance. And then, they get the paperwork and they hand us the money and there's nothing else to it. Like it goes deeper than that. There's sort of this like bi-directional translation that I described that happens. If you comply for long enough, basically it starts to shape who you are and how you understand education. Like, I don't think even before we go through any of the real, the big money or the big programs, I don't know how many cheder teachers would recognize themselves in what some of these Hasidic schools look like. There's just a lot of sort of the, structuring that happens in a secular school that's become imposed over these yeshivas. So that's sort of the first big set of steps. So I don't consider this like one strategy. It's sort of a set of strategies. It's different ways of like basically symbolically complying, like using these different sort of markers to indicate that you're complying. And then it impacts the schools and also the regulators in particular ways. The second one, which I think is actually one of the most interesting ones, is this category conflation, which is basically the idea that advocates for these yeshivas do their best to draw no distinctions between the different kinds of yeshivas. So this will range from, how they negotiate with regulators and politicians by trying to basically use high-performing, never hasidic schools, right? So, high-performing yeshivish schools that offer relatively high level of secular education to non-hasidic ultra-Orthodox boys, and they'll use girls' schools to say, look, we get a perfectly good education. And this will also extend to some of the lawsuits that were filed during this conflict with the Department of Education. There was one lawsuit in 2019 that I talk about in my paper. There are 5 yeshivas on it. Not a single one of them is a Hasidic yeshiva. And they're like saying how, their graduates become doctors and professors. And it's like, you're not a Hasidic yeshiva. So it's sort of this, this conflation that happens in order to present yeshivas as synonymous. And it plays on this idea that many secular regulators, many secular Jews cannot for the life of them tell the difference between a Hasidic school and a yeshiva school. It all looks the same. And there's this really hilarious story that I talked about in my JTA article, I think, if it made it into print, I believe it did, where the New York Times, published an article and put a picture. I think they first put a picture of a yeshiva in Queens that had like a relatively high secular education. Then they replaced it with a yeshiva in Flatbush. It was just like one thing after another. And, the Jewish media had to hate it. They thought it was hilarious that the New York Times kept screwing up. But it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell the difference if you don't know what these schools are. What's interesting about this is that this also extends inwards. So during the first attempt to pass regulations in 2018 and 19, I believe, the yeshiva a campaign to start this massive letter writing campaign to submit comments to the Department of Education, basically telling them yeshivas are amazing and don't impose these rules. And they use these scare tactics that talks about how the DOE is going to make everyone have 7 to 8 hours of secular subjects a day, which would be a problem for modern Orthodox high schools that are sending 99%, or I don't know, 99, like 95% of our graduates are going to college, right? Like we're talking extremely high socioeconomic status schools would not be able to comply with that. And it was obviously absurd. And eventually they had to concede that it wasn't true, that the Department of Education was doing this, but it was very effective, right? They got 140,000 comments, and many of them were from parents or students from schools that would have no problem complying with the regulations. So it goes inward as well, where they sort of conflate and say, well, the state Department of Education is coming for you next, The Department of Education does not have the time or resources to come for high-performing modern Orthodox schools. This is not happening, They barely have the resources to do this. They're only doing this because they're essentially being forced to do this. So that's sort of the big issue. The third strategy is what I call discursive resonance, which is a fancy way of saying, basically, over the years, this is what I mean that I'm tracking it semi-chronologically. Over the years, there's been more and more exposés of the problematic educational practices in these schools, right? And so it used to be that yeshiva advocates would essentially deny, right? They would conflate, they would just not say anything, just submit their paperwork, try to just keep a low profile. They would, say, no, just look at this amazing school that has not an all Hasidic boys school, and just that kind of thing. They would do whatever they could to kind of just evade the topic. But as the number of exposés started to mount, they had to sort of develop a different technique. And so they basically developed this, what I think is a relatively sophisticated technique, but it's also extremely honest. They just argue that Talmudic education gives students the same skills that they would get if they were getting a secular education. And they do this, when I say they do this in a fairly sophisticated way, I mean, for example, in the yeshiva advocates' response to a lawsuit filed by Yafed in, I believe, 2019, Adina Schick, she's a psychologist and a professor, and she wrote this defense of yeshivas, where she uses research on students who are ESL students, English as a second language. The research basically finds that if you bring a bunch of kids to an English-speaking public school and you just dump them into a classroom with a language that they don't know, they're not going to do well because they don't understand anything that's happening. And so it basically advises that you start them off in their own language, and then eventually you transition, and it finds that the outcomes are better right? This is, pretty well done research. But what's interesting about it is that she mobilizes this research to argue this is the yeshivas are doing just fine. They're teaching strong comprehension skills through Talmud. They're learning a little bit of math. They're learning a little bit of science. They're getting all of the same skills, and it will transfer. The big question that's left unanswered is, when does it transfer? And also, it also doesn't address the fact that the content is really different. It's not like you're learning science and literature in Hebrew and Yiddish. You're learning completely different content in Hebrew and Yiddish. So that's something that is obviously not addressed by this literature. But it's that sort of thing. And I have multiple quotes in the paper where they just basically say, we're trying to convince them that this is doing the same thing. And I heard this from politicians and from regulators who basically argued like, yeah, maybe this would work, and we can see this happening. This can work. So I think it has at least some degree of success. And one of the big things that I talk about in my paper that I don't think has gotten anywhere near enough attention is one of the ways I saw this particular tactic seems to have worked really well is that they convinced this is not the Department of Education, this is the Board of Regents, to accept a high school degree that's entirely religious studies, just straight up has just Talmud. And they created this entire complex program that regulates these Talmudic high school degrees that are in complete conflict with Department of Education requirements. So you sort of see the regulatory conflict that's going on here with the Board of Regents and the Department of Education are just not talking to each other about this at all.
Actually, sort of on that note, flip things around a bit because, your focus is sort of obviously broadly on how hasidic yeshiva schools avoid oversight, but it's as you've sort of kept saying, it's also about the officials and the institutions at sort of the state level and the secular level and the dysfunction of these officials and keeping private schools accountable. You've got this part of the paper that notes local district authorities are legally empowered to review non-public school students' academic progress, yet employees at the 8 district offices you called in 2014 and 15 all professed ignorance of the regulatory authority, and some were certain that state officials were in charge, but state officials seemed equally mystified. So can you talk more about how the state has seemingly set itself up for being taken advantage of? Because that also seems like a really big part of the story of what's going on here.
I preface this somewhere in that very long paper by noting that the general state of American education is one of profound fragmentation. So it's America in general, the American polity in general is a federal polity. So that means everything happens in this sort of federal, state, local fragmented system. There's some really good work on that in sociology about how education is a very fragmented system of governance. But I also think that in particular education, that is the case because it's so bottom up. So what you've started having, and particularly in the past 20 years since No Child Left Behind in 2003, is we've started to have a huge amounts of money coming from the federal level, but it all goes through state and local hands, and it needs to be distributed, and everything needs to go through that. And so it becomes this sort of system where yeshiva advocates can appeal to different gatekeepers, people who have access to certain kinds of funding, people who have access to certain kind of resources, and that aren't necessarily speaking to each other because the system isn't really set up for centralized governance. That's not at all how American education works. You can get schools in public schools that are just a few miles apart, and one of them has a huge amount of resources and the other one has nothing. And so it's just, there's no centralization in American education overall. So this is a much larger story than yeshivas. And then there's also the larger story of the role of religious schools around questions of church-state separation. So this is something that's not entirely unique to the U.S., but it's one of the few countries that has such a rigid church-state separation. So this is a very different problem. In a country like France or in a country even which France is dedicated to secularism, but it's still doesn't have that same idea that you cannot give any secular funds, state funds, or similarly in Canada or in other countries where you don't have quite that sort of attitude. So a lot of this is about this legalistic issue of private schools, want to be able to do what they want. But at the same time, states have an obligation, and many state constitutions obligate states to ensure that every child receives an education, right? And so there's sort of this like focus on the child, not on the school idea that happens in funding, where they basically say, you're giving us money to help these individual children. So if these children are eligible for textbooks or these children are eligible for special education, you just do it through the school. And then the fight will basically be about things like who should actually provide the education. Should it be public schools, unionized public schools? So this was a big fight in 2012, where the yeshivas had been eligible for years to get special education funding, and they weren't taking it because the only people that New York State would give them to teach these studies, these special education programs, were unionized public schools who wanted to teach it at 11 a.m., which is when Talmud class is in full swing, right? Like we're not doing, consonant and vowels in the alphabet at that time. So they had this, big arbitration, and they basically agreed to allow them to use third-party agencies. And these third-party agencies essentially work with the schools. They allow them to hire religious teachers. They allow them to hire people who are going to come at 4 and 5 and 6 p.m. And so they work with them around that issue. And that's what I mean by regulatory accommodation. It's not all about money, though it's a lot of money, but it's also around regulatory accommodation. But this focus on the child has also enabled current apologists for yeshiva to argue that, all these people who oppose funding for yeshivas are basically saying we should withhold lunches from poor children. As if like yeshivas are the only way that we could get these lunches to poor children, so it's sort of an interesting like way of justifying it. But ultimately these schools do end up being vessels for huge amounts of funding through this focus. So in terms of thinking, but to answer your question, the reason that the Department of Education is sort of structured to cooperate with these yeshivas is because of the fragmented structure of these schools, because of the separation of church and state. And the last thing I'll say is because the U.S. in general has always underfunded public education and public educational resources. So there's just not enough funding. So everyone's sort of fighting over a small pie with an increasing number of students. And so you end up with all kinds of conflicts as a result of that as well.
Something else I've been curious to ask you is, on the conflation note, why do these high-performing schools agree to go along with the conflation? Why do they agree to be lumped in with lower-performing hasidic yeshivot to make a point to the state? Like, if they're fine on secular education, why are they enabling lack of it in other schools?
So, this is definitely a question I've had as well. What I have been hearing from, the non-Orthodox people who will argue against these regulations is basically they genuinely believe that this opens the door to state intervention in their schools. I think that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the point I didn't quite get to in my answer to your last question, which is why don't the schools intervene? Why doesn't the state intervene in the schools? When I say they don't have enough money, they don't have enough money to intervene. Like this idea that they have the resources to go start closely surveilling every modern Orthodox or Catholic school is beyond bizarre. Like they do not have those kind of resources. I think also it's interesting to see the difference between the rules that were proposed and then knocked down in 2018, 2019. So they were a little more broad and sweeping. And so a campaign, and it was the first time, right? It was the first time that the New York State explicitly said, we are going to start regulating these educational institutions, which the New York Constitution has empowered them to regulate for decades. But this was the first time they actually said, we're going to do it. And this is what I mean with that. Really, all the power is in these administrators. It's not really the elected officials. They can pass all the laws they want. But if the regulatory agencies don't have the resources or the will to enforce those rules, to enforce those laws, it's really meaningless. By the time they pass this most recent set of regulations, it's a lot more specific. It's a lot clearer that high-performing schools are very unlikely to be bothered by these rules. So there was still a lot of yelling and screaming about it, but ultimately there wasn't the same sort of intense response and that I think happened with the first set of rules. I may be wrong about that. That wasn't my impression, at least. I may be wrong. There certainly was, a campaign against it as well. I will also say that in terms of modern Orthodox responses in particular, I think it's interesting to see that because, again, most modern Orthodox families would never dream of sending their kids to schools that provide the kind of education that hasidic boys' schools provide, in part because modern Orthodox communities are very committed to making a lot of money. It's a very expensive lifestyle. They have very high education levels and they have extremely high income levels, non-Orthodox Jews. And that's not going to be possible if you have these kind of relatively low educational standards. But I think there's sort of the sense of a little bit of a sense of alliance, but I think mostly a sense of fear of how it might affect them.
I also wanted to ask sort of about the standards and what was and what is now sort of more recently been approved. You mentioned this sort of a little bit in your paper, and I think the JTA article you have. But can you say a little bit about sort of what these new standards that have been approved, how they seemingly don't really address any of these underlying issues, and there's still pushback from the Hasidic community, but that doesn't necessarily fix anything.
The rules have a few different ways of enforcing these schools' compliance. And one of the issues is that it immediately gives some of the schools an out. Like basically they say the local school authority, the LSA, is not going to review the school at all if it meets certain requirements. One of those requirements is registration. And the problem with that is that some Hasidic schools, some Orthodox schools are not registered, but some are. For example, Oholei Torah, which is the flagship Chabad school in Crown Heights, is registered with the state. Oholei Torah offers 0 secular studies, less than any other Hasidic school. So it's pretty bonkers that, that would be the standard. My understanding is that the DOE claims are going to review the registration status of some of these schools, but how they're going to figure it out, I think, is still an open question. How they're going to actually do that is still an open question. So it's something like that is a problem. Another thing is it talks about if you basically have like a organization that, internally reviews the secular standards, and it's supposed to meet all kinds of standards. But I mentioned before that there's a high school program that is already essentially enabling these entirely religious high school degrees for Hasidic and also non-Hasidic Yeshiva graduates to use in order to get state tuition funding for college, like rabbinical college degrees that are also entirely religious. Now, college degrees can be entirely religious in the same way that college degrees can be entirely about dance theory, in theory. But in practice, the idea of a high school degree being entirely religious is extremely unconventional. But what I'm trying to say is they already have the infrastructure in place, and all they need to do is develop that and expand that somewhat in order to be able to enable something like that, like an internal organization that would manage. And that would just, again, go back to it would help sort of solve the problem that the Department of Education faces, which is they don't have the resources to closely manage something along the order of 100 Hasidic schools, right? If they can even figure out which ones are the Hasidic schools. So they don't have those kind of resources. So I could easily see where the, yeshiva leaders basically get together with the DOE and say, look, let's come up with a solution together. Let's do this collaboratively. And next thing you know, absolutely nothing has changed. I do think one of the things I've talked about this with people is that you do want to consider that the schools themselves, in terms of enforcement or in terms of issues, you have to think about them along different axes. So one question is, different Hasidic schools offer different types of secular education. Pretty much all schools, Hasidic boys' schools. So we're only talking about Hasidic all boys' schools. Let's just make that clear to your listeners. We're only talking about Hasidic all boys' schools. We are not talking about every human you see in a black hat. Many of them are highly educated. We're certainly not talking about women's schooling. Some of those schools are not good either. Some of them might be very bad. Some of them might be good. But in terms of Hasidic all boys' schools, most of those offer a secular education programming almost entirely somewhere between grade 2 and grade 8. And so that means there's nothing really before and there's nothing really after. Some of them end in grade 7. It depends on the school. And then when they offer that secular education, it's relatively minimal. That being said, there is still a lot of variation. Some of the schools offer it's 45 minutes and it's just not taken seriously. Some of them offer an hour and a half to 2 hours a day, and it actually is taken pretty seriously. So there's variation amongst the schools themselves. And one of the biggest distinctions you have to remember is that the high schools generally do not offer secular education at all. And so I think in terms of people thinking about, what can we do to change things? I think I personally would come at it from a place of let's work with the schools that are already offering something. I think the fight with Oholei Torah will be much bigger than the fight with a school that is already offering some educational programming. The other axes we have to think about is that most, but not all Hasidic schools, the boys are predominantly Yiddish speaking. And once you're talking about kids who don't speak English, that just makes things a lot more challenging. They don't necessarily, I shouldn't say they don't speak English, but they don't speak English well. It's not their dominant language, either for reading, writing, or speaking. And so that just makes things more challenging. And so, for example, Orly Torah doesn't offer any secular studies, but they are predominantly English speaking. So to some degree, that makes things a little bit easier for them if they get tutoring outside of school or if they find other resources for gaining secular educational skills. So these are sort of, I think, the two major axes to think about in terms of how this education works.
So you pretty much hit one of my other questions, which is sort of the what comes next in all this, which is great. The last question I have for you is sort of a weird one, but an important one, I think, to ask in context of this, because, you know, the New York Times has written this big expose about this, although Jewish media of all different stripes has been reporting on this for years. And a lot of, you know, secular, non-Orthodox, whatever sort of moniker we want to use, Jews who are not in the Hasidic community are seeing this and obviously have feelings and thoughts about this. And there's a lot of, it sort of intersects with a lot of sort of unfortunate stereotypes. Jews are taking public money. Jews are, you know, tricking public officials. Jews are controlling power. Like all of these anti-Semitic stereotypes sort of feed into this larger story. And that sort of adds to the bias that, frankly, a lot of, you know, more liberal, non-Orthodox Jews have against more sort of observant Jews. So how do we sort of navigate these things to make sure that we're talking accurately about this issue and addressing it? Because I think, frankly, it is an issue of ethics, of public spending, of law, of all the things you laid out, but also not falling into the pitfall of being anti-Semitic ourselves against, you know, our fellow Jew and you know, perpetuating these issues and sort of self-hatred.
I think that there's a few things to consider. The first thing is that this idea, you know, very liberal Jews who are usually very big fans of using government funding for a variety of social causes, suddenly being really upset when it's being used by Hasidic schools. There's something fundamentally, I think, a little funny about that. There's a long history of advocacy in Jewish communities that goes back way before the current sort of welfare state model, you know, where Jews would advocate and try to get state support in whatever way they could. And this, you know, what the Good doesn't, what the OU doesn't, what all these other advocacy individuals and organizations are doing is building on that tradition and just trying to improve schools. And again, usually the money is not, they don't go get school money for the, you know, these 20 Hasidic boys schools or these 100 Hasidic boys schools. They get money for all of the yeshivas, all of the schools. They work with Catholic schools as well. They're just trying to basically support getting resources to private schools and to religious schools, and the Hasidic schools happen to benefit. And there is something to the fact that a lot of this money is going toward things like security and food and special education funding. And you can ask questions. Some of that may be well used, some of them may be poorly used. And those are questions that I think the New York State Department of Education should be asking. But the idea that the money is going to yeshivas is not, I think, fundamentally problematic. It's just a question. I think it's somewhat distinct from the question of, is the educational level in these schools at a standard that the New York State Education Department should be allowing or even enabling? So that's one thing I want to say, is to sort of make that distinction. The other thing that I think is really important here is to disentangle the question of educational and economic outcomes from funding the schools. For the most part, we don't fund schools entirely based on long-term socioeconomic outcomes of the graduates. You know, we fund schools because we're trying to provide an education for kids. And so that's really what the question should be. I've heard there's a lot of, you know, advocacy for secular education in Hasidic schools that takes the tack of, we need to make sure that, you know, the Hasidic Jews don't end up, you know, poor and don't end up unable to support their families. I think it's incredibly difficult from a statistical perspective to disentangle having large families. The average family, Hasidic family size in the New York City metropolitan area is 5.6 children. That is incredibly high compared to the American average. How do you disentangle that from low educational levels? We have mixed data on how poor Hasidic Jews are. We do have some evidence that at least some Hasidic communities are very poor. The 2011 Jewish Community Study indicated that Hasidic Jews are poor. Many Hasidic Jews are poor and near poor. But then recently there was a Nishma study, I believe that's what it's called, the organization that they did a survey. And so this was a national survey. So I'm not entirely sure how the term hasidic was operationalized and defined in the survey, but they argued that ultra-Orthodox Jews are doing fairly decently. So I think the data is a little bit mixed. I also think the economic landscape of the ultra-Orthodox world is shifting a lot. I see this when I keep up with ultra-Orthodox media, and I see like all these different types of degrees and different types of not just degrees, but also enterprises that they want Hasidic Jews to develop. So, just like there was, I think, an article in the New York Times about how many ultra-Orthodox Jews are involved in Amazon sales. So just things like that. You just see a lot of that happening. And so I just think the economic landscape is changing, and it's really hard to know how much of this is about because we think it's important that children get an education versus how much we think this is about we think it's important that, they have an education so they can make a living. So I just think there's a lot of different things that are disentangled here that we need to disentangle. I think we have to understand there's a lot of variation in these Hasidic communities. And with all of that said, I do think we have to recognize the reality, which is that in many of these Hasidic old boys schools, the secular education level is pretty abysmal. And people who try to claim otherwise just are ignoring the very well-known evidence on this. And so I think, that's important to recognize as well. I think bringing sort of like bias and rage and frustration and like, why do they wear their long payas out and just conflating all of these sort of is silly and not productive. And so we should just focus on the real issues at hand.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share. And hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news stories or reports referenced for this episode.